India and the world have been witnessing major protests in recent times. The ongoing Cockroach Janata Party protests against exam paper leaks and repeated instances of misgovernance in the education system are the latest example. Before this, we also witnessed factory workers across Delhi NCR protesting to demand sustainable wages. And just a few years ago, we witnessed two major protest movements: the CAA NRC protests and the long and resilient farmers' protest that forced the government to listen to their concern. Yet, despite the central role protests have played in shaping societies, they have increasingly acquired a negative reputation among many ordinary citizens in India. Governments often portray them as obstacles to development or stability, while sections of the media cast doubt on protesters' intentions. Many people accept these narratives and begin to see protests as serving the agenda of particular groups. But history tells a very different story. This is Newsreel Asia's We the People series. We stands for wise, empathetic, and engaged, and that's what we want you to become. In this series, we explain political, social, and psychological concepts that help people like you become better and more engaged citizens. In this episode, I want to talk about protests and people's movements, why they matter, what role they have played in history, and how protests remain one of the most important tools available to ordinary citizens. Today, we all have the right to vote. We can refuse to work beyond 8-hour workday and have labor protections. And most fundamentally, you can assert yourself as a member of society equal to any other member. Do you like these ideas, or would you rather do without them? These ideas feel so normal that it is difficult to imagine a world without them. But just a few hundred years ago, these ideas would have been almost impossible to conceive of. What made them possible? Questioning, challenging existing norms, protesting. Protest is not merely an abstract theory or a political tactic. It emerges from human impulses like the desire to be treated fairly, the desire to have dignity, the need for recognition, and the capability to care for our fellow human beings. Why should protests then feel like something one should not be doing? The earliest recorded protest in human history is generally considered to be the strike of the tomb builders at Deir al-Medina in ancient Egypt around 1150 BCE during the reign of Pharaoh Ramses III, when skilled artisans responsible for constructing royal tombs in the Valley of Kings faced delays in payment, which then was in form of rations such as grain and oil. The workers did something extraordinary for that time. They stopped working. According to records preserved, they openly complained about hunger and unpaid wages. They staged sit-ins at temples and public spaces and demanded that officials address their grievances. Eventually, authorities distributed the delayed rations. While the strike did not transform Egyptian society, it demonstrated something notable. Even in a highly hierarchical society where the pharaoh was regarded as divine, there were limits to what people would tolerate when their basic needs were ignored. Even just a few hundred years ago, societies were organized around hierarchy rather than rights. Most people had little political power, few legal protections, and limited ability to challenge authority. Power was concentrated among monarchs, aristocrats, landlords, and colonial rulers. But then came a major rupture: the French Revolution. For the first time, large sections of society rose not merely against hardship, but against the idea of hierarchy itself. The revolution challenged monarchy, inherited privilege, and social status. It introduced a radical proposition that all people are equal before the law. The revolution did not create a perfectly equal society, as we can all see today, but it transformed political imagination. What had once been unthinkable became conceivable. The next major transformation emerged during the Industrial Revolution. Factories created immense wealth, but they also subjected workers to brutal working conditions. 12 to 16-hour work days were common. There were no limits to what the employer could extract from the workers. The idea that a worker could refuse to work beyond certain number of hours simply did not exist. That idea had to be imagined before it could be won. In 1817, social reformer Robert Owen popularized the slogan 8 hours labor, 8 hours recreation, 8 hours rest. Workers across Europe and North America organized around this demand. They went on strike, formed unions, and endured repression. Events such as the Haymarket protests in Chicago became the defining moments in the struggle for labor rights. Over time, these movements forced governments and employers to recognize a principle that today seems self evident. A person's life cannot belong entirely to the employer. The 8-hour workday that we all enjoy today was not granted, it was won. The same story can be told about the right to vote. Voting was never originally intended to be universal. In many countries, it was restricted to wealthy men who owned property. Workers, women, and colonized populations were excluded because political participation was seen as a privilege rather than as a right. Through decades of mobilization, suffrage movements challenged this exclusion. Workers demanded representation, women demanded political equality, anti colonial movements demanded self determination. Gradually, voting ceased to be a privilege employed by few and became defining feature of citizenship itself. In India, our own freedom movement is perhaps one of the clearest examples of the power of protest. The British colonial government did not describe Indian freedom fighters as people working in the national interest. It often portrayed them as troublemakers, lawbreakers, and threats to public order, like many governments do today. Peaceful marches were stopped, protesters were arrested, public gatherings were restricted. Movements were violently suppressed. Yet ordinary Indians continued to organize. They marched, they went on strike, boycotted British goods, refused to cooperate with colonial institutions, and deliberately broke laws they considered unjust. Taken together, these examples reveal a common pattern. The right to vote, the right to 8-hour workday, equality before law, or India's independence movement. None of these emerged naturally. None were inevitable. Each began as a demand that powerful people considered unreasonable, disruptive, or even dangerous. Each required ordinary people to organize, resist, and persist. But how exactly do protests create change? Most ordinary people do not have direct access to ministers, corporate owners, senior officials, or institutions that make decisions about their lives. They may not have money, influence, or powerful public platform to make their genuine demands met. Individually, their dissatisfaction can be easily ignored. Protests bring people together and convert this individual weakness into collective power. First, it makes an ignored problem visible. Second, protest forces media, government, and other citizens to pay attention. Third, it demonstrates strength in numbers. It tells those in authority that the grievance is not isolated and ignoring it may have political, economic, and social consequences. And fourth, protests can interrupt normal functioning. A strike stops production, a boycott affects revenue, a march occupies public space. This disruption is often criticized, but it is also what gives people without formal power some negotiating power of their own. I do not mean to say that every protest is automatically right. Every demand does not have to be accepted. Protests should be judged by what they are demanding, how they are being conducted, and whose rights they may affect. This is why protests are anything but waste of time or intended to cause inconvenience activity. They are often the first visible expression of a problem that authorities have ignored. They emerge from a sense that existing arrangements are unfair and that change is necessary. More importantly, it requires immense courage to take action in the face of injustice. Most people adapt to circumstances. Some people complain privately, and a much smaller number are willing to publicly challenge authority, often at significant personal cost. So, the next time you hear someone say, some people's only job is to protest, or that a particular protest is meant to destabilize your country, pause for a moment. Ask them if they themselves have ever taken any action against any injustice. and assess protests based on questions like what circumstances have driven people into the streets. You may not be affected by the issue, but that does not mean others aren't too. And most importantly, look beyond abstract claims about national stability and examine the real lives affected by the actions or inaction of those in power. People rarely protest because everything is working well. They protest because they feel unheard and believe they have exhausted every other option. When the usual channels of dialogue between people and those in power fall, protest becomes one of the democracy's most important forms of expression. I'm sure you value equality before law, the 8-hour workday, and the fact that India is no longer under the British rule. But remember, we enjoy these rights and freedoms today because previous generations refused to remain silent. Many endured repression, made enormous sacrifices, and even gave their lives in the pursuit of larger public good. History shows us that societies do not become more just simply because those in power decide to be generous. They become more just because ordinary people demand change and refuse to give up until they are heard. Share this video with people who struggle to understand why protests matter. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe to Newsreel Asia's YouTube channel and do visit our website at www.newsreel.asia. There you can find video ground reports, text insights, as well as explainers like this.